Welcome back to our listeners to another insightful episode of Trade and Industrial Strategies Policy Podcast. I'm your host, Nondwe Majundana, and today we have an exciting event to discuss the 17th edition of the African Program on Rethinking Development Economics, or Aporde. Aporde is a 2-week program that has been instrumental in reshaping economic thinking in Africa, and this year's event brought together some of the brightest minds in the field of economists from across the continent. Today, we have a distinguished guest joining us, Mwangi Wa Gĩthĩnji, an associate professor of economics, associate dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and co-director of the World Studies Interdisciplinary Project at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst. Welcome, Professor Gĩthĩnji.
Thank you.
It is really an honor to have you. Your expertise in the political economy of development and the decolonization of economics is truly remarkable. Can you share with our audience a bit more about your research interests and how they intersect with class, gender, identity, and income distribution?
So I went into economics because I saw the vast inequalities that existed in my own home country, which is Kenya. I was troubled by the fact that, I could see people who were close to me who were unable, for example, to continue with their education, whereas other people who I knew who, ended up with same grades coming out of high school or secondary school were able to continue because of their access to resources, connections, etc. So from a very early age, I became interested in the questions of inequality. At the time of growing up also, within the country, there was politically, although we were de facto one-party state, there was lots of discussion about the question of inequality, and particularly inequality around land. Kenya, as you may know, was a former settler colony. On gaining independence, the government supposedly undertook land redistribution, which was willing buyer, willing seller. But in many ways, much of the prime land ended up in the hands of the leadership of the elite. And this became a bone of contention in our politics. So I was exposed to this from a very early age, and that drove my interests in issues around inequality. And from that developed my interests, inequality beyond specifically income, to looking at different groups and inequality, and an interest in Marxian economics, because it's one of the few places that right from its outset looks at difference and how difference appears in the economy in terms of differential payment, how income or production, what we produce, is distributed based on your position in the economy.
All right, we'll get more into that. I know that you held a lecture on inequality with the podiums. And let's start with your first lecture, your public lecture, The Impossibility of African Development, Decolonizing Development. Your expertise in the political economy, could you share some insights on the possibility of African development within this framework of decolonizing development?
When I talk about the impossibility of African development, I don't mean to say that Africa cannot change, Africa cannot transform. What I'm pointing to is the expectation that Africa just becomes a replica of the West is a false expectation. That what we must do is find a way to chart our own path of structural transformation. And our own path must be informed by our particular histories, the particular structures that we have in place right now, and the particular challenges that Africa faces. Unlike other countries, I would say Africa faces a triple challenge. Africa has to structurally transform in an era where universally or globally there's a huge respect for human rights and democracy. These are good things, but they put a challenge because the process of structural transformation is not an easy process. It's a process of actually upending people's lives as they know it and changing how they produce, how they live, and transforming those. Other countries that have gone through this have gone through it in quite contentious ways. So we need to face up to that we need to find a way to do this in a way in the present circumstances. I think closely related to that is the issue of inequality. African economies are highly unequal, and that makes this transformation, which I've talked about, potentially even more contentious. And so we need to address issues of inequality so as to bring everybody on board for the process of transformation. The third challenge is we have withdrawn from us the paths that other countries have used. Given the potential impacts of global climate change, of older technologies, we have to find ways to transform the challenges of global climate change into opportunities.
Would you say that some of the points that you raised about the control of education to transform people and how some of the disposition of languages as a carrier of knowledge is part of that work? And could you expand on how these historical dynamics have influenced society or contemporary perspective on education now that we have to input a further layer of climate responsibility?
My ideas on language and the relationship between language and development are very much influenced by the thinker Mwangi Wa Gĩthĩnji, who's done a lot of work or did a lot of early work and continues to work, starting from his seminal book, Decolonizing the Mind. I think one of our greatest challenges as Africans is to be able to stand up proud and stand up to the world and present our own positions on what we think our future should be. Part of our history has been the stripping of our dignity, leaving us vulnerable to basically charlatans who will come and tell us what we should do without actually knowing what the actual lay of the land is. So where this connects to education is the need for us to build an educational system that not only gives us technical skills, but gives us pride in our cultures, pride in our languages, right? And understands that our languages are not simply means of communication, but they're also carriers of knowledge. And so there are ways that our languages carry knowledge and our cultures carry knowledge. And so we can reach into them for things that can help us even going into the future. So, thinking about climate change, for example, you ask about climate change. You would think, given the way we learn, that Africans did not engage in management of their environment, that they just kind of lived off the environment and did not engage. But if we learn a little bit about our societies, we'll find that our societies had various approaches to managing the environment. So, for example, amongst my own people, the Gikuyu, cutting down of trees followed per certain restrictions. And in fact, to cut down a fully grown tree, one had to make sacrifices to their ancestors. And the sacrifices were commensurate with the size of the tree. So the older and the larger the tree, the bigger the sacrifice. This was effectively a kind of tax policy, right?
Yeah.
On managing the environment. There was a recognition that these trees were important to us, right? And though we put it in spiritual terms, in terms of the trees being used by the ancestral spirits to live, therefore you had to ask for forgiveness when you cut them down. This was actually a management of the environment because we had agroforestry systems where we did use the trees. It's not that we did not cut them down, but there was a cost to cutting them down. That cost was commensurate with the role the tree played in the particular space it was. So there are these ways in which our languages and our cultures can connect as sources of knowledge to issues that we deal with today. You put that together with the pride that then won the ability to stand up and articulate our own positions that would come from being comfortable in our languages and in our cultures. That is part of the process of decolonizing. That is part of the process of decolonizing our minds and putting us in a position to forge a different vision of Africa and African economies.
So you speak passionately about dismantling the system. I mean, practically, what would that look like? Because everything you've said is really poetic and it's a beautiful concept, but sometimes to create it into something that is practical and tangible, what would dismantling the system look like?
Yeah, my recently dearly departed friend and comrade, Michere Mugo, who is one who has professed ideas of Utu and also, along with Amilcar Cabral, expressed ideas of liberated zones, is where I would begin. I think sometimes we are overwhelmed by the challenge of the grand problem. But I would argue that each one of us in our own little spaces can create liberated zones. Whether it's a small project in our rural areas where you begin introducing these ideas, whether it's in the schools, in the primary schools, in your local churches or in your local communities, right? This is where I would advocate we begin. If we think of the grand problem, I think sometimes one can feel overwhelmed and lose hope, all right? But I think everybody in their own little way can think carefully about what they do and that they can decolonize that space. How is it that they can envision a different Africa within that space? And then from there, we need to start building movements, right? Because this work is not work that's done by individuals. It's not work that's done by government. It's work that's done by movements which put government to task, right? Make the government accountable. So I think we start from the bottom up in whatever little space we occupy and do what we can in that space.
You also did advocate for us to rethink and reimagine Pan-Africanism as a means to preserve the social and cultural fabric of Africa to drive structural transformation. You share your insights on why this call to return to Pan-Africanism.
We must recognize that in terms of economies on the world stage, Africa is, at this point, in terms of total output, a bit player. Okay? And the only way, right, that we can negotiate better positions is not as individual countries, but as a continent. Okay? We're a big player, but we have tremendous amounts of resources which the world desires. Countries left to their own are overwhelmed by the powers of, the other countries. And it's not only because these other countries are powerful in the sense of having economic power, but just in terms of the ability to negotiate. So let me give you a simple example. If you look at negotiations which used to take place for the World GO, most African nations would have delegations that were 20 or less. Most of the negotiations took place in parallel sessions. So negotiations over different commodities were occurring at the same time. Individual African countries did not have the capability to actually just being in each room to negotiate deals. African countries did not have that. If you take like a country like the US, it had over 400, a delegation of 400 people.
Sure.
Over 200 of them were trained lawyers with economic backgrounds. So we are left at a big disadvantage if we try and approach these things one-on-one. If we get together and put together our forces and, agree on African positions on the trade, then we can have, different groups of people who negotiate on behalf. So that's just a simple example of how, bringing our resources together allows us to expand. Then we can also think of various industries or just, now dealing with climate change, global climate change. We're going to have to come up with new industries, new kinds of products to approach this. Again, every country will need these new products, but not every country, in fact, no single country on the continent, has the capability of producing all these products. We are then left as just importers of these products. But if we are willing to, again, come together and designate, right, certain countries as producers of specific products for the rest of the continent, then we might be able to build the scale, an industry or two industries per country that provide for the rest of the continent. So these are ways in which a Pan-African approach would help us transform our economies and make life better for our populations.
That's a very compelling perspective. Let's move on to your lecture on inequality. What are the drivers of inequality in your opinion?
I think African inequality is driven by the structure of our economies. Our economies are made of small, very highly productive export enclaves that were often part of the colonial economy. It could be mining in the southern African region, cash crops in other parts of the continent. But often these sectors of the economy have little connections with the rest of the economy. They produce a good that is then exported for processing often outside, although there have been improvements in the degree of processing. We're still doing very little processing of our minerals or our crops. So in the value chain, we get the least amount of value added. You take coffee, which is one of the most traded goods in the world, at one time just second to oil. The farmer may be getting as little as 20 cents in terms of the US dollar from a kilogram of coffee. Whereas the person who's selling a cup of coffee, right? A cup of coffee in the US can get 75 times that amount. Now, if you think of the amount of processing that goes on in coffee, it's not that much. It doesn't account for 75%. But it's the fact that the coffee has landed in a much higher income market, and the person who's landed it there is the one who gains that. So it would be very different if Africans were able, for example, to land their own coffee in these richer markets, to be the ones who roasted them, right? To be the final sellers rather than selling raw coffee beans, for example. We can say the same thing about cocoa. It wasn't until recently that any African country was actually producing chocolate. Again, you have countries in Europe that produce no cocoa, but produce most of the world's chocolate. Again, the gap between what farmers get paid for cocoa and what a producer gets paid for chocolate is huge. So we need to be able to go to that next step, and be able to get into the production, the final production, and also the selling of final products. Let me just take a step back because, I kind of digressed in that answer. So I was explaining the enclaves. So these enclaves don't do this final production. How that comes back to the relationship to inequalities, because since they're not connected much with the economy, even if they grow, they don't result in a lot of employment growth.
Sure.
And so what happens is when there's growth in our economies, and the growth often is driven by the enclaves, right? So if you look at African growth, it's always highly related to commodity prices, okay? When they grow, then the returns are just going to a very small group of people, while the vast majority of us don't get these returns from African growth. And that's what drives the inequality. So you need to transform the economy in a way that the high growth sectors are also connected to the rest of the economy. And the way we do that is transforming those enclaves so that they are connected in the ways I've talked about, in them producing industrial goods, employing more people, and taking in inputs from the rest of the economy. Okay? So just a last example on this, the way this might happen is, let's say we take, for example, tea production. When African countries export tea, a lot of it is exported in bulk. You send it out in sacks, okay? So again, little connection with the rest. If, however, you are marketing the tea, the final product, the tea bags, as a final product going out, then what you're doing is you're also having to get inputs in the form of boxes, in the form of the satchels the tea goes into. And those then are drawn from other parts of your economy so that the multiplier effect on employment is bigger. So that's the way we must begin to transform these economies.
It sounds to me like we need to do a better job of marketing ourselves and finding more capacity in that as well, because you've mentioned the gap between the amount of money that a farmer can make from the initial product to the end product. So do you think the methods for measuring income inequality are still relevant, such as the Gini coefficient, or do you have additional methods that you find are particularly valuable in providing a nuanced understanding of income distribution?
So I think the measures are relevant. I think our challenges, of course, are often data is not readily available, and we've not invested as much in data collection. I think it's important for our governments to realize the role that data can play in managing and growing our economies. This is not something that we should take lightly, but should become integral to the process of transformation, because having the data and then making it available to researchers then allows for a broader set of work, for more ideas to be put into the discussion of how do we deal with these issues. While the Gini measure is an important one, I want to emphasize that, group inequalities are also large in the African context. So we must go beyond just the headline Gini measure and really discuss what drives the inequality, have honest conversations about the differences, the gender inequality, the spatial inequality between different regions, the sometimes ethnic inequality that exists. So we must measure those and also study those and really discuss them more fully in order to address the issues that we face.
Yeah. In your expertise, I'm curious to hear your insights on why historically Kenya has been considered one of the most unequal societies in the world as a Kenyan.
Yeah, I think the Kenya that we know today is a colonial creation, right? There's no running away from that. And again, it comes to this economic structure which got created, where we had an economic structure which had a relatively highly productive commercial agricultural sector based on large farms. And unfortunately, with independence, with the exception of maybe tea, the agricultural sector, the commercial agricultural sector, remained very much the same. So, as you know, Kenyan patriot and someone who got assassinated for his challenges to the government, J.M. Kariuki, said, we simply replaced the Keiths with Kariuki, the Jack with Odinga, or, any. I didn't mean that's the first name that came to me, but, with just, we did not actually change the structure of the economy. So that was the big failure. And the same case was in the industrial sector. We had a few highly productive sectors. But again, these were owned by a few people. So if you don't have some transformation that gives access to a broader group of people owning capital, managing capital, then you're going to be stuck with these inequalities. So we still have these super large farms in the Kenyan context. You have farms which have become game conservancies like you have in South Africa. Over 100,000 acres or hectares, and even bigger than that at times. Okay? So as long as those continue to exist and they are owned by single individuals, then you're going to have that continued inequality.
And I think another thing that you stressed was the importance of prioritizing and understanding poverty as it relates to this topic. I mean, because while you speak about the few that are privileged to have all of this capital and all of this, the people at the end of that are the ones who are left in dire poverty. Can you elaborate why it's crucial to give this issue a prominent place in this economic discourse?
It's important because obviously dealing with the bottom, right, in terms of access to income, the bottom of our societies, the poorest, helps us deal with the problem of overall inequality. So it's important in that sense. It's also important because these are the people who have the least access to things that can help them produce, and that's a deadweight loss to all of us, right? If someone else cannot produce, it means that it's not just a loss to that individual, it's a loss to the society because that person can then not contribute to society. So it's important to think of those groups of people. Having said that, I'm also clear that we don't want to have our development policy be simply about poverty management, right? Our development policy must be about wealth creation, which then allows us to take people out of poverty. So, at the center of this must be how do we transform our economy so people have the opportunity to get out of poverty rather than just dealing with the people in poverty, how do we help them? So these two things must go together. And at times, particularly donor-driven conversations about our economies tend to focus on poverty management rather than the transformation of our economies.
Let's conclude then this discussion and take any closing remarks on your side or any other insights you may have on ways we can continue rethinking our development economics in Africa that you would like to share with the audience.
So, thank you very much. I think there are a couple of things. One which I'll just reiterate, the importance of understanding our histories and the inherited structures of our economies. I know often people get tired of hearing about the role of colonialism and how it has impacted us and want to focus and say we've made our own mistakes. And I want to give people an analogy. If someone is stepping on your neck, you both say that they're stepping on your neck and you try to get them off your neck. So with colonialism, we need to note what it's done, and we also need to work to get rid of its impact. So it's not one or the other. It's actually a combination of both. I think African countries also need to recognize successes where they have occurred. Share across our nations more often the successes that have occurred. We may not have nations which have transformed, but there are a lot of sectorial successes or individual industry successes or educational sector successes, etc., that have occurred. I think these are much more important for us than looking to the rest of the world for what has worked in the rest of the world. I think if we begin to understand that successes which are closer to home can teach us more, and will also help us have pride and confidence that we ourselves can replicate these successes, is very important in our march to transform our economies.
Thank you. That is a very crucial perspective. Your work exemplifies the importance of inclusivity in this research, in this policy space. We're grateful that we have had you today on our show. You have given us hope as a continent, and we are so grateful for your insights. We look forward to your continued efforts in reimagining and reshaping Africa's economic future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
And to our listeners, follow us on all our social media platforms, on the Aporde alumni page, and keep up and follow our page to get more of this research and policy making conversations. Thank you.